Here's another question for you.
This guy is amazing. He takes on 25 atheists by himself, one at a time. And this is one of the conversations that they had. You got to watch it to the end. It's amazing.
Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All right.
you a very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning, sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you speak between what's true and what's false? So you could imagine.
Right? I can infer. I can.
From what principles?
So, and what are you getting at?
I'm getting at the fact that your conscience guides you. Is that reasonable?
Conscious is defined by my empathy and my reason are my foundational.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
right
and wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits of engaging with and nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway, there's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten. But then reasonably, like, I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Okay,
how do you constrained by reason?
Do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah.
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree, who's correct?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right? We do that in real life all the time when we have, whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where we can converse with each other, think about things, explain our perspectives, and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this is kind of goes back to where I'm saying initially.
I'm not defining it. Elijah defined it.
Okay, so as Elijah defines God.
It's defined that way in Jonah too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also defined it that way.
As I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm just pointing out to you how God is defined in the Old Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how
statement.
do we specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, again, it goes back to my example of the Mona Lisa.
I'm defining God as conscience.
Okay, so that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of God.
No, I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay, so
in Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever. So
it's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All right.
He's equal in stature to Moses.
Okay.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. You accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous.
In what way?
Because, again,
I asked you if you believe that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question, and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not in the least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you hypothetically disbelieve in.
It's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I don't care about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people tend to use these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of God.
point. You did.
I did. Well, I
made a specific point that God was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
All right. Well, it was very nice to meet you.
Nice
I appreciate
to meet
the
you too.
conversation.
Yeah. It's very brave of you to do this.
Thank you.